A similar confusion then occurs with respect to the role of victim avoidance behavior in the economic analysis of environmental law. So occasionally the harms of pollution and other environmentally impactful activities can be avoided either by reducing the activities themselves or through the adoption of avoidance behavior on the part of potential victims. So in the emissions rulemaking for mercury, a key issue raised by environmental justice advocates concerned the higher levels of contaminated fish that are consumed by members of Pacific Northwest and Great Lakes Native American tribes and other subsistence fishers. So not surprisingly, exposure estimates reveal these individuals to face much greater health risk from mercury than was predicted by the EPA's general population models. So then the question arises, should the tribes be made to abandon their traditional practices if it would be monetarily cheaper for them to avoid being harmed than for society to avoid harming them? From the welfare economic perspective, there's no a priori reason to prefer one or the other approach, given that everything depends on costs and benefits stripped of moral content. Indeed, the genius of Ronald Coase's storied article lies precisely in upsetting traditional ways of describing environmental problems through moralized terms like victim and polluter. While Alfred Pagoo had argued that industrial firms impose negative externalities, Coase instead insists on seeing only reciprocal relationships between parties who desire to use a resource that cannot be jointly achieved. So this thinning out of environmental law's normative dimensions continues today in the apparent global consensus support for cap-and-trade greenhouse gas emission schemes, a policy approach that does perhaps promote allocative efficiency, but that tends to obscure questions such as who is emitting, for what purpose, and in light of what historical contribution to existing greenhouse gas problems. Now, the EPA, under an executive rule from the Clinton era, had been required in its mercury rulemaking to analyze the environmental justice implications of its rule. But rather than truly acknowledge that monetized costs and benefits don't exhaust the normativity of policymaking, rather than engage in a thorough inquiry into what it would mean in moral and historical terms to force Native American subsistence fishers to choose between, on the one hand, their health, and on the other hand, a cultural practice that's significantly constitutive of their identity as a community. Rather than do that, the EPA instead reported, and I'm not making this up, reported with apparent relief that the emissions limit it chose was not so stringent that tribes would have been disproportionately benefited by the rule. So in other words, because the traditional practices of the tribes had made them more vulnerable to mercury pollution, they had more to gain from reducing emissions. So apparently it would have been unjust from EPA's perspective to bring all groups to the same level of risk from mercury exposure, given that some groups had a higher baseline risk level. But of course this assumes the baseline risk is somehow neutral, and that all we need to do is look at costs and benefits when we make laws and regulations, rather than look at the moral texture of our history. So I believe that passing moment in the EPA rulemaking betrays the depth of ideological capture that cost-benefit analysis has wrought. It seems to me only an overextended form of welfare economic reasoning, one that just sees disembodied welfare impacts to the exclusion of the lives and the communities and the histories that are visited by those impacts, could have possibly identified unfair benefits to Native Americans as the chief environmental justice concern at issue for mercury. Consider, in this respect, an analogous case from anti-discrimination law, where we've attempted with some success to force employers to hire, promote, and fire without regard to race and other protected statuses. In the absence of those protections, many individuals within disadvantaged groups historically have attempted to mask or alter their identity in order to pass as members of the dominant group and receive equal or at least better treatment. So as Kenji Yoshina's taught us in his lovely book, this need to cover aspects of one identity continues today, most prominently with respect to sexuality, which is not yet protected by anti-discrimination law at the federal level. Now, to the welfare economist who's tasked with quantifying costs and benefits of anti-discrimination law, the fact that individuals no longer need to cover in order to receive fair employment treatment might be viewed as an identifiable, perhaps quantifiable, perhaps even monetizable benefit of the law. Covering is psychologically costly, to say the least. But if the welfare analysts went further to express the concern that minority groups might be disproportionately benefited by anti-discrimination law, because dominant groups, of course, have no covering expenses to save, then the analyst will have lost sight of the moral ground for legislative action. If the analyst goes even further to suggest that covering might be a less expensive way to obtain equal employment treatment than anti-discrimination regulation, then at that point, to echo Bernard Williams, the analyst will have had one thought too many. The analyst will have made the content of anti-discrimination law depend on its consequences rather than having let those consequences flow from its morally determined content. Now, in my view, much confusion and controversy in the environmental law context arises because we are having one thought too many. So as a result, the economic approach condemns laws as inefficient or misguided without actually understanding their aim. So the monetary value of human life is made to reflect the apparent willingness to pay of workers to reduce occupational risk, when instead the value of those workers' laws is meant to be enhanced through democratically conferred legal protection. The environmental fate of future generations is made to depend on values such as the present market rate of interest, when instead those values should depend on a legal market backdrop that has placed sustainability constraints on resource use. The likelihood that uncertain but possibly catastrophic events will occur is made to depend on the subjective estimates of technocrats, when instead the likelihood should hinge on whether the responsible political community is willing to countenance disaster among its legacy of achievements. So in short, the promise of environmental law is that the needs of future generations and non-human life forms and other missing interest holders can be given foundational legal importance, so that ensuing costs and benefits that are observed by economists will reflect a prior determination by the political community to pursue environmental sustainability. Proponents of regulatory cost-benefit analysis instead try to force sustainability into the language of pre-existing cost and benefit schedules that are simply read from an unsustainable and arbitrarily privileged status quo. So lawmaking from this approach comes to mean ever more refined tinkering with a given liberal market system, the unexamined rules of which form the set of constraints under which maximization occurs. The transformative potential of law is thus curtailed. Just as economics experienced its marginalist revolution in the 19th century, promoters of cost-benefit analysis hope to subject law to a marginalist revolution in the 21st.